Hi, thank you for joining us. My name is Louis Brogdon. I'm here with Speaker Newt Gingrich, and we are here to talk about his new book, Beyond Biden, which came out this month. He is going to be signing copies for you all and talking a little bit about the book, what led to it, why it's important, and importantly, how you can get it. You can go to premiercollectibles.com/beyondbiden. That's all one word. So again, that's premiercollectibles.com/beyondbiden to get your copy. And to start off the conversation, I think we'll just ask the speaker to give us a sense of what led him to write this book, why he thought now was the time, and why it was important. So,
well, I really looked after the election of Biden. You know, normally as a good conservative, I'd be tempted to do an anti-Biden book. Here's what's wrong with Kamala Harris. Here's what's wrong with Joe Biden. But as I watched them, I realized the country was going to figure out that they couldn't do their jobs. And the country was going to become pretty depressed about it and pretty angry about it. In fact, the latest poll showed 38% approval for Biden, 28% approval for Harris. I thought, we don't need to pile on. What we need instead, and this, if you'll notice the title, which is Beyond Biden, we need a sense of hope that beyond the current mess, there's something good happening. And I've been helped because, and Louis is a fellow Georgian, the Jimmy Carter years, which involved high inflation, high unemployment, foreign humiliation like the Iranian hostage crisis. You know, you could have said at the end of that, boy, things are really terrible. But Ronald Reagan came along, and all of a sudden, within a matter of a few months, things seemed better. And by 1984, Reagan was campaigning on Morning in America, and everything was moving in the right direction. So I wanted to pick up on that Reagan tradition, which I had worked with and been part of. And it seemed to me that rebuilding the America we love, which is the subtitle of Beyond Biden, really captured what most of us want. We don't want to give up on the country. We don't want to focus on being angry with an incompetent left-winger in the White House. We want to figure out, how do we get America back to being the kind of country we want for our children and grandchildren? That's what Beyond Biden's about.
well, that's great. Well, rather than asking my own questions, we're going to open it up to some of our viewers. Stephanie from Iowa asks, in a time when there is such division and polarization, how do we come together for a resolution?
I think it's a great question, Stephanie. I think you have to set big goals that people agree on. When we did the Contract with America, which led to the first Republican majority in 40 years, we set a goal of reforming welfare, and people agreed that the work ethic mattered, that children will be better off with their parents going to work rather than being subsidized by the government to stay home. And so we had a huge majority, I think 90% of the country agreed. In fact, when we passed the bill, half the Democrats voted with us. It was very bipartisan. And similarly, when we moved to balance the budget, about 89% of the country thought that it was a moral imperative to get back to a balanced budget. People have to balance their own budget. Businesses have to balance their budget. Why shouldn't the federal government? So I think one of the things is, and I try to describe this in Beyond Biden, finding projects that are big, but that people really want, that allow us to once again be the most successful country in the world. Almost all of us want a school system that works. We know that young children, particularly in poor neighborhoods, really need an education so they can break out. So part of the purpose of Beyond Biden was to lay out these kind of positives, which I think, Stephanie, will bring people together and will help us get beyond the current tension and the current partisanship.
Okay, and speaking of that tension and partisanship, Connor from Suffolk, Virginia says, as a Gen Z, 18-year-old off to college, how do I have a dialogue with someone who has a difference in opinion on topics such as COVID, vaccinations, gender identity, etc.? These things that are sort of deeply polarizing us right now.
You know, Connor, that's a great question. And I'm glad you asked it, because I suspect there are a lot of people who wonder about that. My leadership model has always been listen, learn, help, and lead in that order. So I would say you start out by asking the other person, by trying to unlock them. Why do you believe this? What led you to believe this? Under what circumstance do you think you might change your mind? What evidence would have an impact on you? Rather than you talking at them, I think you want to talk with them. And in order to talk with them, I recommend you get them talking. And it takes more patience. I mean, I have to tell you, in all the years I've been doing this, there are days when I have to say to myself, listen, learn, help, and lead. Because you might, like everybody, my first instinct is to talk, not to listen. But I know that as a leader, the more I listen to people, the more I understand them, the more willing they are to then let me help them because they believe that I actually care about them. And so I would say, start every conversation by listening and by asking questions that unlock people.
And this may be related, but Bobby from Indianapolis asks, what is something you would charge the next generation with doing?
I would say a couple of things. First, focus on really helping us understand how can we reform the education system so that everybody you know gets a good education, to get a good job, to be able to be a good citizen. And since you're actually trapped in it, you're there now, you're seeing it, you probably have a better sense of what works and what doesn't than somebody like myself who's a grandfather. I would say second, foster optimism. We're at the edge of breakthroughs in medicine. We're at the edge of breakthroughs in going into space. We're at the edge of breakthroughs in virtual reality and artificial intelligence. Your generation may well see more new, exciting things than any generation in human history. But if we go around being negative and destructive, which the news media fosters, I used to tell people that if Thomas Edison invented the electric light today, it would be reported in the news media that the candle making industry was threatened, rather than look at this great new invention. If the Wright brothers learned how to fly today, it would be emphasized in a story that said, you know, the stagecoaches were threatened this morning. And they'd always look for the negative. But I think, in fact, literally, this is not hyperbole. As somebody who used to work with Alvin and Heidi Toffler during the period when they were writing Future Shock and then the Third Wave, I think the future is going to be unbelievable. I think your generation, many people you know are going to end up going into space. I think the cost of space is going to come down dramatically. It's going to be the equivalent of flying to Australia within 15 years. And that's going to give you a chance to literally open up the entire solar system, not just the entire world. So I'm excited by the future, and I think you're going to find enormous opportunities to have a better future.
Getting back to kind of more current politics, Sean from Detroit, Michigan asks, do you think our current leaders have America's best interest at heart? It seems as if they haven't kept one promise that they spoke before winning the election.
Well, I think if you ask them, they would say they have America's best interest at heart. And I think they would probably be shocked if you told them how much they had failed to keep their word, which is unfortunate because I think it makes it all harder to fix. The people currently in charge have a different vision of what's good. They have a different image of what has to happen. And so I think for most of us, the more we learn about their approach and their philosophy, the more we're turned off by it. And I suspect they're very frustrated. If I were Joe Biden and my staff walked in and said, you're at 38% approval, or even worse, if I was Kamala Harris and they walked in and said, you're at 28% approval. I mean, these are staggeringly low numbers. And there's no reason to believe they're going to get better in the near future, because as long as inflation keeps going up, every time people buy gasoline or buy food or pay for electricity or pay for rent, they get angry again. And so I watched this happen with Jimmy Carter, it just gets out of control. And, you can argue all you want to, but the person you're arguing with is remembering, oh yeah, I filled up my car yesterday. I know how much more it costs. So so I think, I don't think they mean badly, but I think that their vision of how the world works is wrong. And I think as a result, they can't do well, even though they mean well.
To build off Sean's question, what advice would you give to conservative members who want to make sure their constituents know that they are keeping their promises and to keep focused on those promises?
Well, I would say to conservative members, first of all, go home and practice the leadership I talked about. Hold town hall meetings and listen to people. And even if they're angry at you, listen to them, let them get it out in the open, let them ventilate. People are grateful that you have the patience to allow them to talk. So I would start with that. I would say second, look for the success stories. Everywhere in America, literally in every one of the 435 districts on all 50 states, there are entrepreneurs doing cool things. So highlight the successes, highlight the doctor who's developed a new therapy, highlight the local factory that's competing successfully with China, highlight somebody who's out there who's invented a new breakthrough concept, and or somebody who just hired 200 people for their business. There is a certain advantage to the old song of accentuating the positive. And I'd say to every conservative, you go find the people who are doing good things and doing the right things and highlight them, and a lot of the negativity will disappear as people realize how much good is going on in the world.
And I imagine this may also apply to Vanessa's question from Washington, D.C., but she said, how did you start out in politics? You've had great success. What is a piece of advice you would give to someone who is just starting out in the political world?
Well, Vanessa, that's a very good question. I got involved in politics because my father was a career soldier, and I came to believe, while we were living in France and Germany in the late 50s, that countries can die and that you need leadership dedicated to fixing the country and meeting the challenges of each generation. I have just a couple pieces of advice. One, if you really want to get into politics, find a campaign and go work in it. When I was a student in high school, I worked as a volunteer in the Nixon Lodge campaign in Columbus, Georgia, when the Republican Party was so small that even if you're only 16 years old, they were grateful you showed up. So go find a campaign headquarters for somebody you like and go to work as a volunteer. Read biographies, read the story of people who've been successful. Read history books. I mean, what happened in a particular period? How did Trump rise, or what did FDR do that allowed him to be the only president elected 4 times? And all of these things, politics is very complicated. It's essentially a civil war fought by other means, fought by ballots rather than bullets, fought in campaigns rather than on battlefields. My favorite term, I guess, is cheerful persistence. You get up every day, you go out and you do everything you can, and you collapse exhausted, and the next morning you get up, you go out and do it again. I ran for Congress twice and lost. By the time I won, I'd been campaigning for 5 years. And then I decided that we had to have a program to become a majority. When I arrived in Congress, we've been in the minority as Republicans for 24 years. Well, it took 16 years. We lost in 80, 82, 84, 86, 88, 90, and 92. We finally won in 94. People say, what a great year. And I keep thinking, yeah, you should have seen the other campaigns. So I would say, if you're going to get into this business, you have to be very persistent. You have to be cheerfully persistent. You have to be grateful for the opportunity to try, not assuming automatically that you're going to win.
Okay, and in Beyond Biden, I know you write about kind of keeping civil discourse and getting away from this kind of cancel culture and this kind of knee-jerk reaction by the left to just shut people down. David from San Antonio asks, what is the balance between respecting our leaders who are in place, but not agreeing with their policies and just going along with the agenda? How do you have that discourse?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think first of all, you have to recognize that nobody you like is going to be 100% perfect, and no one you dislike is going to be 100% bad. So, because we're not a country that's produced an Adolf Hitler or a Mao Zedong or a Joseph Stalin. So you want to find a way to find a common ground as human beings. One of the reasons we were able to balance the federal budget is that President Bill Clinton and I spent 35 days negotiating in the White House, step by step, inch by inch, and you get to know each other. So part of it, I think, has to be reaching out, listening to each other. And the first principle of discourse is to listen, not to talk. So you've got to have the other person has to know that you're willing to be part of a genuine dialogue, not just a debate, and that you're willing to try to learn as well as to teach. And I find that when people learn that, you have the beginning of a real relationship and a chance to become friends, which I think Clinton and I got an amazing amount done because we were willing to work together. And we didn't worry about who got the credit, and we didn't worry about ideological partisanship in an extreme sense. He defended his side, I defended my side. But our goal was to try to help America by getting things done, not by avoiding getting things done.
Very good. Skylar asks, what is your response to the culture war taking place? And how has the rise of secularism had an impact on American citizens?
Well, I think the culture war is real. I think there are people in this country who would impose on the rest of us a set of radical values. You see them sort of experimenting with things like mandates for vaccination. You see the way they've tried to say that if you show up as a parent because you're concerned and you go to a school board meeting, you might get visited by the FBI because you might be a domestic terrorist, and some of which is crazy and very un-American in my judgment. Even the American Civil Liberties Union, I think, is beginning to get a little worried about how aggressive they're being in the use of government power. So I think the culture war is real. I think that the other side would impose their values if they could. They've tried through the schools, and the result has been they've created the largest parent backlash that I've seen in my lifetime. And I think you're going to see a parent, student, and teacher alliance opposed to the bureaucrats and the teachers union, which is very left wing, much to the left of the teachers. And so I think the average teacher wants the right to teach their students and to help them learn how to find the truth, not how to be brainwashed and indoctrinated into something that's been handed down from somebody else.
We've got a fellow Georgian, Gary from Atlanta asks, what is the biggest lesson you've learned in your career in politics? And also, thank you for all you do for our country.
Oh, it's very nice of you to say that. I think the biggest lesson I've learned is persistence. Churchill described it, was asked to come and speak to Harrow, which was the prep school he'd gone to. And he went as the prime minister in wartime and said, never give up, never, 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 never give up. And I think there's a lot to that. The biggest lesson I've learned is that you get knocked down, you get back up. You get knocked down again, you get back up. I mean, let me tell you, campaigning for 5 years, losing twice for a congressional seat was sort of character building. But I wouldn't have minded winning the first time. But I frankly was probably a lot better for having lost twice and having to think it through and learn from it and go back out and meet with people. You know, and in the end, it worked out pretty well.
So in Beyond Biden, I know you write about the COVID-19 pandemic quite a bit and the various impacts it's had on our society, economy, across the board. Jerry from Massachusetts asks, what is your response to the vaccine mandate for employees and companies over 100 employees? Did you ever think you would live in America where it would be legal to say no jab, no job?
I think that it is totally wrong to have a government mandate and for the government to use employers to intimidate and pressure people. I think I personally have had 2 vaccination shots from Pfizer and a booster. And I think it's the prudent thing to do to minimize the risk of getting COVID and to minimize the impact if you do get it. But I think the idea of the president issuing an order that would lead to millions of Americans being unemployed, and then in a number of cases, cutting them off from unemployment compensation. I think it's just totally wrong. It's anti-American, it's anti-freedom. And while I'm willing to advocate that it's a wise and prudent thing to get vaccinated, I'm totally opposed to the federal government requiring you to be vaccinated. And I think that it's a very, very dangerous precedent, because who knows what else they're going to come down the road and decide that they want to try to impose by presidential order, which is, I think, totally outside the Constitution.
For those who are just joining us, we are here with Speaker Newt Gingrich. He is signing copies of his latest book, Beyond Biden, Rebuilding the America We Love. And you can get a signed copy of that book by going to premiercollectibles.com/Beyond Biden, all one word. So that's premiercollectibles.com/Beyond Biden. We will now go to Greg in Stillwater, Oklahoma. He said, do you think this crisis started before the 2020 election? Which I presume he's just talking about the kind of rise of wokeism and all the things you talk about in Beyond Biden. When do you think Americans lost sight of true American values?
Well, I think the seeds of all this start in the early 1960s with things like the free speech movement at Berkeley. And Reagan's election in 1966 was in part fueled by public outrage at radicals at Berkeley and the degree to which they were rioting and tearing things up. People forget that the last big wave of a cultural crisis in 1969, we had 2,500 bombings in the United States. We had a professor killed at the University of Wisconsin. We had another professor at Columbia lose his lifetime's work because radicals broke in and destroyed his office with all of his lifetime of research. We had, by the early 70s, I think there were 12 policemen in New York City who were assassinated, deliberate killing program by the Black Panthers and their allies, who made no bones about it. They were out to kill policemen. So we tend to forget that we've been through waves like this. What's happened is these are bigger waves. They've had more time to consolidate the universities. They've had more time to infiltrate the news media. They've had more time to win office. So this is probably 5 or 10 times bigger a threat than it was in 1969. But it's not new. These are people who, many of them dislike America deeply. Biden has nominated one woman who has said she thinks that many companies are going to have to go out of business in order to achieve her goals, something which I suspect those companies and their employees don't agree with. And you have this whole collection of people who aren't particularly, they don't want to make America great again because they don't think America was ever great, and they don't particularly want to see America be at the center of the world.
In Beyond Biden, you've got a chapter called Bipartisan Baloney that talks about, contrasts the election or the campaign messages that Biden had of unity and bringing the country together with the actual things that have happened since Biden took office. One, given the recent elections in Virginia, where Republicans won mightily, and in other places, do you see this administration moving to that more to that bipartisan approach, or do you see them just continuing to push what they've been pushing?
Well, let me say, first of all, it was very striking to me that Biden gave an inaugural address that was very bipartisan, come together, cooperate, the same day he was repealing 16 or 17 of Trump's executive orders. Now, to do both the same day, and not understand that the act of ripping out what your predecessor did without any consultation totally undermines your speech. So by the end of that very first day, we knew that he didn't mean anything he'd said. He had decided he was going to govern with the big government socialists. He was going to adopt a big government socialist program, and they were going to try to govern from the left. And that's what he's done very consistently since then. And as a result, the country is now responding at two levels. One is most Americans don't want us to become a socialist country, don't want us to become a woke, radical country. So that, and then secondly, it ain't working. I mean, so part of his problem is you have open borders and over 1 million people come in without being checked for COVID, without being checked for criminal records. You have a withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is done so badly that it's a disaster. 13 young Americans get killed. You have, it's just a sheer technical incompetence. When they're going to have Buttigieg in charge of implementing $1 trillion infrastructure bill, the most he's ever been in charge of as mayor was $10 million. And they had a huge pothole problem in his hometown that he was mayor of. So the idea that they're going to turn over this much money to build in 50 states with a guy who couldn't even fill up the potholes in his hometown gives you some sense of how whacked out this is going to be. And I think that's been a big part of their problem.
You just mentioned Afghanistan, and I know that due to the publication schedule, the Afghanistan evacuation happened after the book had already gone to the printer. Given the scale of that event, what might a chapter about Afghanistan look like in this book?
Well, I think it would focus on 3 very different things. So, as you know, since you've worked with me for a good while, it might have become 3 chapters. One, it would have looked at just basic honesty. I did a podcast recently, Gingrich 360, what we call Newt's World, with a writer at the Washington Post who got access to the internal interviews of the Inspector General in the Pentagon, who had opened an office specifically on Afghanistan. And the degree to which senior generals lied to the American people is breathtaking, staggering, beyond anything I would have dreamed of. So first of all, I would say one of the lessons from Vietnam, from Afghanistan and Vietnam, is if you can't describe it honestly, why are you still doing it? You know, in the heart of a free society, you have to have an honest conversation with leaders you trust. And this was a huge undermining. The second point I'd make is we had 18 years for the American military to figure out how to win, and they didn't. And that actually comes out again in this book on the Afghanistan papers. We didn't have a model in Vietnam, and we don't have a model in right now in Afghanistan or in Iraq, or you go down a whole list of places. These kind of conflicts don't fit the kind of war we'd like to fight. And we are unwilling culturally to have our big systems rethink what they're doing and design a strategy that might have worked. The third point I'd make is that once you decide to leave, and certainly after 18 years, it's not irrational to say we've done enough. These guys left like fraternity members who had been wildly drunk for 3 days. They didn't tell our allies. They didn't tell the Afghans who were on our side. They didn't think it through. They abandoned Bagram Air Force Base, which is the absolute key to control of the country, and which the Trump people had already said they were not going to leave because it's an hour away from the Chinese nuclear testing facilities. So the number of things they did wrong at an execution level, I think by itself would call for a very bold overhaul of the Pentagon. And I don't blame Biden for their incompetence. I do blame the State Department and Biden for having abandoned Americans. And I blame them for having imposed limitations that didn't work. But I think in the end, the senior military has an obligation to say, you can't do that. And if you insist on it, I'm going to resign. And they didn't meet their professional requirements, in my judgment.
Craig from West Covina, California asks, why don't you get a good group of congressmen together to get a new contract for America?
I think actually that's a great idea. And we hope to have a contract with America twice, once in 22 and once in 24. And I think it's a terrific concept. and I'm glad that Greg asked about it.
Speaking of Connie and Temecula, I hope I've pronounced that correctly.
What is this?
Temecula, California. She is a big fan and said she's excited to read this book. And what is the next project you're working on?
That's Temecula.
Temecula, that's probably right. Apologies. Being from Georgia,
I'm getting a big yes from Rebecca, so.
Oh, great,
I have a
excellent.
belief that, of course, she would side with me anyway, still.
But
So
Connie,
what did he ask?
Connie asks, what is the next project you're working on / issue you're tackling?
Well, Connie, I've concluded that there are three huge challenges to American survival as a free country. The first is to rise to the challenge of the Chinese Communist Party dictatorship and the drive that it has, which I think is very impressive. As a historian, I think the Chinese right now, the Chinese Communist Party, is doing an amazingly effective job of becoming a very, very powerful competitor. Second, I think that we have to recognize that virtually all of our bureaucracies are industrial era dinosaurs that just don't work. I mean, my favorite example is the Pentagon, where they opened it in 1943, 78 years ago. It was designed for 31,000 people to manage a global war using a typewriter with carbon paper. Now, what's the relative information exchange rate between an iPad, a laptop, a desktop, or a smartphone and a manual typewriter with carbon paper? I mean, it's got to be 100 to 1. But we still have 31,000 people sitting in the Pentagon as though they were using manual typewriters, and it's a disaster because it means you have too many people with nothing to do. So they issue questions to people who have something to do, and those people can't do what they should do because they're busy answering the questions. And it is totally screwed up. I mean, it's an unbelievable mess. And of course, the giant corporations are happy with it because with their lobbyists and their ties to Congress, they're going to make money and then have no great interest in reforming the machine that feeds them. Same thing's true with schools. Same thing's true with all these big government departments. You have to ask, I'd say fairly often, you ought to reduce the Pentagon to a triangle and put the other 2/3 of it into being a museum of military history, and you'd have a better defense department. But I'd say you could walk through Washington and do the same thing at every level. If you look at the number of people we employ in the Department of Education, who, to the best of my knowledge, never see a single student. You think to yourself, okay, now we say we're spending more on education. We're actually spending more on bureaucracy. We're not spending it on the teachers. We're not spending it on the students. We're spending it on the bureaucrats. So, if your battle cry was, we need more bureaucrats, people figure out that was stupid.
Candace from Louisiana asks, how important do you think the family unit is to the well-being of a country?
Well, Candace, first of all, my sisters now have a sister named Candace. And second, since you're from Louisiana, right?
Mm-hmm.
I went to Tulane and spent 3 wonderful years in New Orleans. So we have lots of things in common here. I think that the core family unit is unbelievably important. I think reattaching males to their children is extraordinarily important. And I think that it is been very destructive. There's a terrific book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, which talks about how the ideology and the values of the woke left have actually made life harder for the poor. There's also a remarkable book by Charles Murray called Losing Ground, which points out how the Great Society's welfare programs actually made life worse for African Americans and for poor people in general. So I think when you adopt policies which encourage the breakup of families, which encourage young women to decide to be single mothers in a setting where in the long run, you don't have the psychological support, particularly for young males. It's very difficult for young males unless they have older males to model off of and to learn from. And I think it's a huge problem. I think it's one of the central themes we ought to be debating more in American society.
Again, for those who have just joined us late, I'm here with Speaker Newt Gingrich. He is signing copies of his latest book, Beyond Biden, Rebuilding the America We Love. You can get your copy at premiercollectibles.com/beyondbiden. That's all one word. premiercollectibles.com/beyondbiden. And so we will now go to Cindy from Dallas, Texas, who says, what do you say to citizens who are still voting for candidates like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris?
Do you like that gasoline price? Do you like how much it's going to cost you to heat your house this winter or air condition it next summer? Do you like having 1 million people come in the country with no test for COVID and no test for criminal records? Do you like having the murder rate go up 30% in a year, the fastest rise in murder rates in American history? If you like all those things, vote for them again, because you'll get them. But in fact, if you don't like those things, you better be prepared to replace them, because their policies and their approaches are what's causing this. And the simple truth is, big government socialism doesn't work. And I'd simply say to people, you think this is working? And I think most Americans would say, no, it's not working.
Charlie from Jacksonville, Florida asks, your career in politics has been high stress and busy. What do you do for fun?
I read books, I watch movies, I go golfing with my wife, I visit zoos. I look a lot at dinosaurs and at paleontology museums. I just hang out. Actually, I don't think there's been much stress in my life. I like what I do. I'm happy to be doing it. I like people. And I learned when I was very young that sometimes liking people means you have arguments. I'd want a sugar pie. My aunts didn't want to make me a sugar pie. The tension about convincing them to make me a sugar pie, which is a little tiny pie made out of the extra pie. We put in sugar and butter and cinnamon. And those are the places I learned to cope with, deeply stressful moments.
We have one final question from Karen in Minneapolis. She says, do you have any predictions for the 2024 election?
I actually have a very good friend named Karen in Minneapolis, but I don't think she'll be calling it. Yeah, I think that if things continue as they are now, we have the largest Republican advantage in the generic ballot, which is which party would you vote for, since 1981. My guess is, and I think it'll get worse, not better, because I just don't think these guys can solve anything, because the structure in their brain is wrong for dealing with the real world. So I expect we'll pick up 40 to 70 seats in the House, which will give us the largest majority since 1928. And I suspect we'll pick up 4 seats in the Senate. It'll be an amazing election night. We have a lot of work to do between here and there.
Well, Speaker Gingrich, do you have any final thoughts for our viewers?
Sure, look, let me just be obvious. I think Beyond Biden, as Sean Hannity likes to say, may be the most important book I've written. We're at a point of real turning in America. This book, I hope, will help people understand that we can rebuild the America we love, and that we have to focus beyond just beating up Biden and Kamala Harris. We have to focus on what needs to be done that's right to make this a better country. And I hope people will tell their friends and neighbors about Beyond Biden.
Well, thank everybody for joining us. And again, you can get your signed copy of Beyond Biden by going to premiercollectibles.com/beyondbiden. Thanks for joining us, and hope you enjoyed the book.
Hey, this is John Acuff, New York Times best-selling author of 7 books and someone who's done a live signing. If you like the one you just watched, make sure you check out our YouTube channel. It's full of amazing authors having great conversations and signing books for viewers just like you. So make sure you subscribe, and thanks for watching today.